اليوم فاتح على حسابك والله.
Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Lebanese, and these are today's headlines. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri says he is optimistic about electing a new president soon, revealing that pressure will be stepped up to end the presidential vacuum. Heads of state from across the Arab and Muslim world gather in Saudi Arabia for the conclusion of a counter-terrorism military exercise. And the UN says children and the disabled in South Sudan have been burned alive, and pro-government militia were allowed to rape women as a form of payment. Heads of state from across the Arab and Muslim world have gathered in Saudi Arabia for the conclusion of a counter-terrorism military exercise that included 20 participating countries. Saudi state television carried images of tanks firing missiles and helicopters circling overhead in what local media have called the largest exercise ever held in the Middle East in terms of the number of countries taking part. The military drills, dubbed Northern Thunder, took place in an area near Saudi Arabia's northeastern border with Iraq and Kuwait. The training focused on how to coordinate combat operations and guerrilla warfare tactics among the Muslim-majority countries that are members of a larger counterterrorism alliance announced by the kingdom in December. The exercise comes amid heightened tensions between Saudi Arabia and its regional rival Iran as they back opposite sides of the wars in Syria and Yemen. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri says he is optimistic about electing a new president soon, revealing that pressure would be stepped up to end the 21-month-long presidential vacuum. While reaffirming his commitment to supporting MP Sleiman Frangieh's candidacy for the presidency, Hariri said he will not vote for MP Michel Aoun, who is backed by Hezbollah, some of its March 8 allies, and the Lebanese forces. The head of the Future movement said the election of a president was the key to resolving the country's problems and healing its economic woes. In a wide-ranging interview with LBCI channel last night, Hariri said, quote, "All the Lebanese want a president, therefore we must go down to parliament to elect one. There is no reason that prevents us from going down to parliament unless some want a presidential vacuum." In the interview, Hariri also criticized Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian war and the party's intervention in regional affairs. Lebanese Forces Chief Samir Jaja has acknowledged the cracks within his March 14 coalition, but denied the alliance was in danger of collapsing. In a statement issued by his press office, Jaja blamed the rival March 8 coalition for the delay in presidential elections and the accumulation of trash. UN envoy to Syria Staffan de Mistura says the possibility of federalism for the war-ravaged country has not been taken off the table for the upcoming peace talks in Geneva. The latest rounds of negotiations in the Swiss city, scheduled for Monday, coincide with the 5th anniversary of a conflict that started with protests against President Bashar al-Assad before descending into a multi-sided war. Neither the opposition nor the government has yet confirmed its participation. Diplomats told Reuters that major powers close to the UN-brokered talks were discussing the possibility of federal divisions in Syria that would grant broad autonomy to regional authorities while maintaining the country's unity as a single state. Speaking in September, President Bashar al-Assad did not rule out the idea of federalism, but said any such change should only come about as a result of dialogue among Syrians and a referendum to ratify any changes to the constitution. Syria's opposition says it will attend peace talks that were set for next Monday, but downplayed the chances of reaching an agreement with the Syrian government. The UN-brokered talks, which coincide with the 5th anniversary of the start of the conflict, will take place in Geneva just over 2 weeks after a ceasefire agreement took effect, which has reduced violence but not halted the fighting. The High Negotiations Committee said in a statement it will attend as part of its commitment to international efforts to stop the spilling of Syrian blood and find a political solution. UN envoy Staffan de Mistura said the talks will focus on new governance, a constitution and elections. For its part, the HNC said it will focus on the establishment of an interim governing forces with full executive powers and will insist on Syria's territorial integrity. An ISIS defector leaks secret registration files to a British journalist. That is coming up next. Welcome back. The Arab League's 22 member states have picked veteran Egyptian diplomat Ahmed AbulLate to head the body in a late-night session on Thursday. AbulLate, who was the last foreign minister under former President Hosni Mubarak, was the only contender of the post of Secretary General. The appointment came at a critical time for the Middle East, with Syria marking the 5th anniversary of its civil war, proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the battle against ISIL raging across the region. AbulLate, who has also served as Egypt's ambassador to the UN, had been widely expected to win approval from the League members. Bahrain's Foreign Minister Khalid bin Ahmed Al Khalifa announced the decision after some last-minute wrangling over the appointment, saying that AbulLate would serve a 5-year term effective July 1st as Secretary General. The UN says children and the disabled in South Sudan have been burned alive and pro-government militia allowed to rape women as a form of payment. A UN report described what is happening in the country as one of the most horrendous human rights situations in the world. The UN Human Rights Office said the report contains harrowing accounts of civilians suspected of supporting the opposition, including children and the disabled, killed by being burned alive, suffocated in containers, shot, hanged from trees, or cut to pieces. It added that credible sources indicate groups allied to the government are being allowed to rape women in lieu of wages, but opposition groups and criminal gangs have also been preying on women and girls. A South Sudan presidential spokesman, however, denied that groups allied to the government have committed atrocities. A disillusioned former member of ISIS has passed a stolen memory stick of documents identifying 22,000 supporters in over 50 countries to a British journalist, a leak that could help the West target Islamist fighters planning attacks. Leaks of such detailed information about ISIS are rare and gave British spies a potential trove of data that could help unmask militants who have threatened more attacks like those that killed 130 people in Paris last November.
أنا بدي أطلب من الناس اللي جوا منضمة على تنظيم كذب يدعي الإسلام، ما فيه شيء بيطابق لشرع الإسلام أبدا أبدا، بعيد عن الإسلام.
Is this information so important that it could actually destroy Daesh?
إن شاء الله إذا وقعت بإيد أشخاص عرفوا يستخدموه أكيد.
And if you were to tell someone how to use it, what would you tell them?
هي معلومات استخباراتية، أكيد الاستخباراتية اللي راح تشتغل عنا. يعني بنصح إنه تتسلم لناس عم تشتغل ضد داعش. الناس اللي فعلا مستنية شيء لتشتغل ضد داعش، مو تتسلم لناس مشان تبيعها وتشتريها وترجع ترجعها على التنظيم.
We've got 51 nationals from 51 countries that we've been able to identify, crosses the whole of the globe, from America all the way to China, a lot of European countries, Britain obviously, and then a lot from North Africa and from the Middle East, Arabia, places that you would expect them to come from. But it's the sort of the nature of the globalization of this jihadi movement that's quite so remarkable, and was very much an active member, but decided that he didn't like the way the leadership was going, he didn't like the leadership being taken over by Iraqi Baathists, and he decided enough was enough, and he took with him this memory stick that has all this huge amount of data on it. He didn't know. Actually, he knew it was very important. He didn't know what was on it, and he took it from the head of internal security of Islamic State, came across the border, and through the network that we've known for a very long time, we eventually were given the memory stick. Many of them have been to every jihadist hotspot that you can think of in a single trip, starting in Tunisia, going to Libya, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, through to Europe, Belgium, France, regularly, and then to Turkey and into Syria. So they weren't on watch lists, and they weren't stopped, clearly, because they were able to travel quite easily.
Amnesty International says sending migrants back to Turkey is not safe, as thousands more migrants arrived in Greece's main commercial port. The Netherlands director for the human rights group, Edward Nazarski, who spent the past few days traveling around Greece, condemned the conditions migrants are facing at makeshift camps in the country. Officials say some 4,500 migrants have arrived in Piraeus in the last 24 hours, and more than 1 million reached northern Europe last year. On Monday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel pushed EU leaders to pencil a surprise deal she brokered with Ankara to halt the flow to Greece by returning anyone arriving on the Greek islands to Turkey. But legal details are still being worked out for an EU summit next week, and many governments are still skeptical of the scheme.
Whatever, and well, I never expected from the Netherlands to see things like this within the European Union. People were getting desperate, not angry, I thought, but people were, well, trying to figure out what was happening now, why the borders were closing, and what could be next step, hoping that the borders would get open. And then now here in Piraeus, I see, well, a lot of people arriving, a lot of people have been here for days, and, well, there's a lack of information, but also a lack of reception. And on that, this plan, if they do that, well, first of all, from a logistical point of view, it's quite silly to get people out of Greece to Turkey and then out of Turkey to Europe. But more important, Turkey is not a safe country for refugees at this moment. In Turkey, Turkey hasn't undersigned the complete refugee convention. In Turkey, there is no decent asylum procedure. Turkey doesn't even respect the rights of its citizens in Turkey. So, well, this trade-off of refugees with Turkey, I hope it will not go on, and I think the deal with Turkey should not continue.
U.S. President Barack Obama and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau toasted each other at a state dinner, making light of their countries' differences, but emphasizing the ties between the two nations. The dinner capped a busy day of talks and meetings between the neighboring countries that are traditionally close, but had strained relations under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
This visit's been a celebration of the values that we share. We, as a peoples, are committed to the principles of equality and opportunity. The idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can make it if you try, no matter what the circumstances of your birth, in both of our countries. And we see this in our current presidential campaign. After all, where else could a boy born in Calgary grow up to run for President of the United States? Where else would we see a community like Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, welcoming Americans if the election does not go their way? And to the great credit of their people, Canadians from British Columbia to New Brunswick have so far rejected the idea of building a wall to keep out your southern neighbors. We appreciate that.
I would argue that it's better to be the leader of a country that consistently wins Olympic gold medals in hockey. President Obama would likely disagree, and yet you still invited us over for dinner. Because that's what friends do. Because, now that I think of it, we're actually closer than friends. We're more like siblings, really. We have shared parentage, though we took different paths in our later years. We became the stay-at-home type, and you grew to be a little more rebellious. May the special connection between our two countries continue to flourish in the years to come, and may my gray hair come in at a much slower rate than yours has.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a recap of our top stories. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri says he's optimistic about electing a new president soon, revealing that pressure will be stepped up to end the presidential vacuum. Heads of state from across the Arab and Muslim world gather in Saudi Arabia for the conclusion of a counter-terrorism military exercise. And the UN says children and the disabled in South Sudan have been burned alive, and pro-government militia were allowed to rape women as a form of payment. Those were today's headlines from us here at Future Television. I'm Minna Tamim, and I thank you all for watching.
واليوم فتح على حسابك والله.